Last month, before I went to the Himalayan hills for a holiday, or the mountains actually, I was working with a few friends in India, and we were looking at past 125 years of data on agriculture in India. Because if any of you have kind of read about agriculture or read about India, one thing that stands out over the past century or more is the frequency of drought and famine that used to hit India every decade or so. And these famines used to typically last for a year or two till the next round of monsoon even things out, or the rainfall. And the death toll couldn't be in the range of millions. That's long before anyone had even coined climate change or global warming. The first historically recorded famine in India happened in 976 AD. And one of the famous rivers in North India was full of corpses because there was no one left to burn the dead. From that to about 1876-77, that was just when the British government or the Queen was taking over the reign in India from the East India Company. In 1876-77, a famine killed 3.5 million, but mostly in the south. And that led the British government to form the Indian Meteorological Department, the office, to track the weather. Because before that, there was no systematic way of tracking, monitoring the weather. That's in 1876-77. In fact, I had when we were working on this, I had a picture from a British author who actually says that this was perhaps the biggest Holocaust of that period. From there to 1942-43, during the war, when the famous Bengal famine killed another 2.5 million, to 1966-67 or 65-66, that was a 2-year stretch, which affected or killed about 500,000 each year, so about 1 million plus, just about 40 years ago. What has happened since is, I think, close to a miracle, because if you read, particularly Americans, authors of the late 1960s, they were predicting food riots in India by the mid-70s. And of course, what happened was quite the contrary. That between mid-1960s and mid-1970s, India virtually made famine history because something happened in India's agriculture, quite irrespective of temperature. The Green Revolution and Norman Borlaug's intervention with the hybrid seeds, particularly hybrid wheat, turned India from being almost written off as a basket case to today, when this year, particularly 2009, has been one of the driest years in recent times. 23% of the country has experienced a drought. But the only discussion we are having is on the price of food. There's no one who's talking of, forget the millions, even hundreds, dying in any part of the country because of the drought. What has changed? It's agriculture. And which I think is almost, to me, particularly if you look at it in the historical context, is as close to a miracle as one can actually find. That in about 40 years, India has gone on to make famine history and been able to figure out a way to deal with drought, which had plagued the country for 1,000 years. And today you can see it coincides with the period when there's so much talk of climate warming and impact on agriculture and impact on the poor. How has the poor been able to deal with it, irrespective of what happens in the climate? Because the key is, in my view, what can we do to face up to whatever happens rather than whom to whom to blame to get out of our present problems. And I think the West, having created a lot of these environmental scares or hypes, right from the days of the DDT in the mid-60s, when DDT was vilified as the worst chemical ever, when DDT is one single chemical that has probably saved more lives than any in human history, because it dealt with malaria. It came from a US author, Rachel Carson. Then to the population bomb, that China and India would simply collapse on the burden of its population and people. Prediction of food riots in India in the 70s, to the 80s when the world was talking about forest and environment and big dams, against the big dams. Late 80s we had the Montreal Protocol and the ozone hole issue, that the white-skinned Westerners might suffer when they visit the southern warmer coasts. And today we have the climate. And the critical thing that seems to have happened, and which is, to me, perhaps the most worrying phenomenon. All the past environmental issues and scares, the people who perpetrated or who promoted those scares were perhaps too confident or too ignorant, whichever way you want to look at them, set too close a time frame. When Rachel Carson was speaking about DDT, she was speaking of the next season of malaria. When Paul Eldridge talked about the population bomb, he was giving less than 7 years to India. What has happened now, and this is perhaps where a lot of the environmental movement and people and policymakers seem to have gained, is that they are now projecting a time horizon which is beyond most humans' calculation or capacities. 50, 100 years is not a horizon on which any one of us would typically operate. And why are they making that? One, they have learned from their past, because they have been proven wrong in all those issues. Africa today is importing DDT much more than in the past 20 years, a lot of it from India. So what they have learned is to enhance, expand the time horizon. That gives two huge advantages, not just to the scientists and others who might be perpetrating those views, but to the policymakers and political leaders. Just think, and that's how probably I'll end and we can have a discussion later. For instance, just think, a prime minister or an MP or a congressman or whatever your political leaders are termed, they find it, particularly in our countries, in the developing world, in Africa, Asia, this seems to have come as a very good excuse to shirk their own responsibility. Poverty is mostly self-inflicted. So what have they found now? They found that an excuse that can be thrown about, that the climate is changing and therefore something has to be done about that, not about poverty, and that the West has the historical responsibility for having contributed to the climate change to pay for it. A complete win-win, and it's the creation of the West. If you really want to understand the policy and the politics of it, that is what we should understand. And that is where we must refuse to accept the time horizon that is being branded about, and refuse to accept the policy prescriptions that is being suggested, because the agenda is not to help the poor or to help anybody. The agenda is political power. The agenda is to perpetuate the conditions so that the establishment can have their power and the people would have to fend for themselves. Thank you very much.